What up, everybody? How we doing today? Good. Wait, a little louder. What? Good. Yeah, I like your attitude. That's where we need to be. Well, first off, I'd like to thank STEMcom for having us today. I always say us because when you work in science, you work with many people. I'd also like to thank Sarah and all the volunteers who made this awesome opportunity. I mean, just look around you. Look how many events are. Look how many cultures are in the stands. Science is about diversity as well, as we'll find out. Something I want to do that I've learned from Australia is before you start a chat or a discussion, you give respects to the traditional owners of the land. So here I'm talking about the Native Americans. I very much would like to extend my gratitude to people and groups like the Illini, the Ho-Chunk, the Potawatomi, the Illini, because without them we wouldn't be here, okay? And thanks all of you for coming today. I got a little warm up here, so I'm Dale Simpson. So, I'm Dale Simpson. I was a wrestler growing up. I started when I was in 6th grade, and I continued through college. I was an All-American in 1995, and I got a wrestling scholarship to go to Canada. Then my junior year, I had to go into field school, and I went to Easter Island. Rapa Nui, or Easter Island, it's in the Triangle of Polynesia. It's about 2,300 miles from the coast. It has the very famous 1,000 Moai statues throughout the island. It's one of the most magical places in the world. I'm most interested in archaeology, the study of material culture, past artifacts, past lifeways. My father always tried to teach me, if you really want to know someone, you got to know where they came from. And that always sparked my interest in the past. Does that say Abraham Lincoln? How do we get from China to Kentucky? You got any ideas on that?
No, I don't, except the Indian trade, maybe.
And there it is.
Wow.
Tiny little thing.
That's much smaller than I thought.
I want an owner with passion who wants to know just as much about the artifact as I do. Do you have any other ideas of how this could have ended up in your field?
I think it's aliens.
On the Found team, my role is to better understand the timeline of how things come in, how they're made within that timeline, and then to give an interpretation. One of my favorite things to do is travel and see the world. I think I definitely have the traveler's gene that people say are in people.
I keep learning, and that's always what I want to do the rest of my life. I want to start out about Easter Island. I'll give you a question in 2 seconds. Let me get a little going, and I get your question, big man. Hold up. So when people think about Easter Island, a lot of visions might come into your mind. You might know something about the night at the museum. What does the Moai say, everyone? Dum dum want gum gum, right? We've seen that part of the movie. For me as an archaeologist and for other people that work in the field, that's very disrespectful because these statues represent people, right? Ancestors. You might have seen the movie Hop. How many people have seen the movie Hop? Did you like it? Really cool. Well, in that movie, they portray people, the statues, looking towards the sea. That's not true either. It's another myth. Most of the statues face inwards towards the village. You might know something about the Kontiki expedition from Thor Heyerdahl. Speaking to some of the more elder folks in the audience, that book was published in more languages than the Bible. And it basically put Easter Island on the map in the 50s. I'll talk a little bit about Jared Diamond, the great synthesizer, who does know science. Now, you might see this guy out there sometimes. He definitely is not an archaeologist, right? And if you really think Easter Island was made from aliens, I'm here to tell you that's another talk down the way. That's not this one, okay? This is about humanity. This talk is about science. This talk is about coming together as groups of people to understand the past. So right away I'm going to say no. Let's do that again. No. And we move on. Because what happens is Easter Islanders are alive. They're a living culture. There's about 6,600 people that live on Easter Island. So if you take anything away from today's chat, Easter Island people did not collapse. They're still alive and well, and many of them are great dear families and friends. So I thank a lot of them for everything they've done. They're very much a living culture. So what's really weird though is that Rapa Nui is in the middle of nowhere. So if you look at where my little crosshair is located, we basically have to go 5,000 miles straight south from our STEM and our STEM event here, and that's a long way to go. The island was annexed by Chile in 1888. So that's what it is, a political relationship. Its cultural relationship, however, is with Polynesia. Today we'll be talking about proud Polynesian ancestors. Now, if I could take all of the water outside of there, this is what the ocean of the Pacific looks like. You'll see a little dotted line to your left there. That's called the andesite line. And that separates the Pacific plate, where Easter Island is located on top of. And we'll see more continental islands like Australia, Papua New Guinea, which were once part of Gondwana. But in the Pacific plate, we have much volcanism happening because of magma chambers. And these things are hot spots, and they end up producing volcanoes that come out of the ocean. On the top there, the diagram is not as fine as I'd want you to see, but Easter Island does not have volcanism anymore. It is off its hot spot. Unlike Hawaii or Vanuatu, some places where volcanism is active, Rapa Nui, people never saw volcanism on the island, okay? So that's something. We don't have Pele like the Hawaiians do, but we understand that the geology is a very important part of the island. We move a little bit closer, we realize Easter Island is a big iceberg. Basically, it's 1,500 feet above the sea level, but it's 9,000 feet to the sea floor. So it's very large. Just one little finger is poking out of this huge island. It has the shape of a triangle, as you'll see, and there's 3 main volcanoes, Ranokau, Terivaca, and Poike. Really what the island is 100 eruptive events. All these different colors represent different types of lava that have pushed through all the volcanic centers of the island. Summertime they give really cool material like obsidian, like dragon glass if you watch Game of Thrones, or some things like topa, which was used to make the very famous statues. So this is another map from a German satellite, and you can see some of the relief of how volcanoes are being pushed to the surface. Well, there's one that's very important, which is this guy right here. This guy, his name is Ranororaku. And at Ranororaku, we have the very famous Moai statues. Right now, we count 1,000 total statues all throughout the island. Much different than people think that there's only a few. There's tons of them. And they're mostly made from one material that comes from the middle there called Ranororaku. But other areas represent different cultural groups of the island, different clans called mata. And these clans were organized very similar to how you'd organize in Hawaii. There's something called Apua'a organization, where clans would have access to the ocean, and they would also have access to inland resources. So they're able to use both things. Now the white line that's in the middle is representing 2 different types of clans, the upper class clans and below in the southern class clans who have a lower rank. So when you look at a map like this, we should be thinking about hierarchies, social political complexity. This is what this map is representing as the base of the culture. Now it's really interesting, for my master's degree 10 years ago, I was very much interested as how then do the elite control resources? How do we go about them in a very difficult environment that's unpredictable ecologically? How do you go about feeding maybe 3,000, 4,000 people in the island in the middle of nowhere? So we use some techniques in GIS, which is Geographic Information Systems, and what we look for is from one location of a platform, which are called ahu, the moai sit on top of the ahu, and the pukau, the hat, goes on top. They have eyes inside the moai because the idea is to keep the eye on the prize, the people, the resources. So we can imagine then that those houses in the middle, that big one in the middle is called a hare nui. This is the main meeting house. You have smaller houses called hare paenga where the elite lived. And the further you are away from the center, the lower your class. Very similar if you go to a beachfront property. You know who the richest people are, right? They're right on the beach. Well, Rapa Nui was very similar. And then beyond the elite, we have the subsistence agriculture. We have chicken houses. We have gardens called manavai that they're growing sweet potato and taro and sugar cane. And then we have things called umu, which are earth ovens that Polynesian people cook their food in the ground. And that would be a big festival that everyone would come to your ahu and eat some of your chicken maybe some tuna fish, maybe a lobster if you're lucky, and if you're elite, you'll eat things like dolphin, porpoise, turtle. But that's another time of my life. Now 10 years later, I'm 5 years into my PhD, and I'm a super senior. I'm really working on finishing up this year, but instead of using GIS, now I'm using geochemical analysis. So simply, if you can just look at the diagram here, this is the island. Some of those volcanoes are a little bit different. Instead of Ranodoraku, I'm going to draw your attention over here, which is an area called Orito. And here we have a beautiful obsidian deposit. So what's the sound, kids in the audience, maybe parents too, what's the sound that lava makes when it touches water? Louder, let me hear that again. That's how obsidian is made. It gets cooled very quickly by the water, it makes glass, and glass, it's so sharp, it's actually sharper than human-made metal. So when doctors make open heart surgeries, they very much use obsidian tip blades because it opens up easier. Now, the obsidian, because we know each volcano has its own geological and elemental profile, I need to be looking at the elements. And if you were here earlier for Joe's talk, he talked about how heavy elements were made when the waves come together, they create this huge event, and that's how we get heavy elements. Well, these very heavy elements is what I'm using to understand how these stones come to be. And what they become is my finger. So if I can tell you one thing, I'm an archaeological detective. And my job is to link up things like fingers, the source, to artifacts, such as an adze or a gardening tool. And what these things become are my fingerprints. And my job is then to see, here's the source, the quarry, which we'll talk about. Here's the artifact and the archaeological record, and my job is to link those things up. Now, I can either go from the source to the artifact, or like a police officer would do, I have the fingerprints of the subject, now I have to go to the source. So we use those type of principles. At the end of the day, what we're trying to better understand is access to these resources, control, exchange, and use. Okay? Those are the things I'm after as an archaeologist. I want to understand how people were exchanging stone in the past. Now, there's two techniques that we use. This will be on the test, everyone. So we have, just kidding, totally joking. The first technique is called PXRF, which is portable X-ray fluorescence. That just shoots excited gamma rays inside artifacts. The way that these elements dance, it comes back into the gun. The gun gives me a profile, and bam, I have all the elements. Now, this is a really good technique because it's portable. I can bring this gun into the field and check things out there. It's non-destructive, so I don't have to, sometimes when you drill holes in people's artifacts, they get a little mad. It's not the easy thing to do, to go to another island and ask them, hey, can I drill a hole in your prized possessions? People don't like that. So this technique comes in handy. I can get at about 31 elements, and this is really good for obsidian. It's a very good way to identify obsidian, but we want to do better science. Anytime a scientist tells you I have the answer, they're not doing it right. Because a real scientist, when you get a conclusion, it only gives you more questions. It's a vicious cycle of the scientific process. So you reform hypothesis, you relook at your data set, you retest, and so forth. So there's a process. But this has got a downfall that it's non-portable. I can't lug this thing into the field with me. Imagine the bag fees. Ugh. But it's minimally destructive because I only need about 10 milligrams. I'll give you an example of a sample. And there, instead of 31 elements that I can look at, now I can look at 57. And that increases my sample size. We also can look at oxides and major elements, which help us understand what these rocks are. Now, as a good researcher, and all you little ones listening, go back to your sources. Go back to the original source. We live in a world of fake news for a reason because people don't go back to the original source. Well, for me, to be a good scholar, what I did here is I looked at every paper that's ever been written about geochemistry. I want to know that I'm not repeating someone's study. So this is how you get the scholarship of science. Some different types, what material were they analyzing, how many samples, and what technique. But when I put this together, what I found right away is that everyone is focusing on obsidian, that volcanic glass, and no one had focused on basalt. And basalt is probably the most common rock in the Pacific. It makes the majority of the islands. It was used for tons of artifacts, and it's a very important source. I found it more troublesome that no one was focusing on geochemistry because there's multiple things made of basalt, like petroglyphs and homes and ovens and platforms and gardens and water collectors on the bottom left there and chicken houses in the middle and sacred structures. All these things come from basalt along with artifacts. Knives, the top left there is a knife that you can fillet a fish with. Fish hooks to catch the fish. On the top right there, or your guys' top right, you have adzes. Some of the small adzes are used as pendants, as jewelry. Some smaller ones are used for making carvings, and the big ones are used to make the moai. So, I have some interest. I'm interested in Easter Island. I'm interested in geochemistry. So then, in science, a lot of things you need to do is build a team. So I need to find the individuals that know the field. And on the top left there, the gentleman on the left, that's Marshall Weisler, the head of department at the University of Queensland in archaeology. And his work has really revolutionized how we see the movement of basalt throughout the Pacific. The Pacific has thousands of islands. So what he does is we look at minimally invasive techniques that 10 milligrams is basically half of the size of your pinky fingernail. Very small. We don't want to damage artifacts. We want them to last forever. But what his work has ultimately shown is, on the top left there, you have gentlemen using the toki or adze to make boats. That was very important for Polynesians. They'd use that adze, they would make boats, and then they can travel around. Well, what we can do is, because we know fingers and fingerprints, certain islands only have a certain geochemical signature. No other island will have that. Therefore, I can then see where artifacts end up. And what we found out is about 1200 AD, when Machu Picchu is gaining its peak, 1200 Cahokia, the city of the sun, is gaining its importance. And right now, in the Pacific, Polynesians are traveling thousands of miles by boat. Pretty impressive 800 years ago. Most of us can't even paddle out into Blackwell, so it's amazing. So all of this, I created what's called the Easter Island Geochemical Project. You can look for us on a Twitter handle there. And basically for 5 years, we've really done some great work. Some 20 colleagues through 15 world institutions. Hopefully 1 PhD, please, will be done. We've got 6 peer-reviewed publications, 5 general pubs, 6 reports for the Chilean government because I work under them. 2 spatial databases, and this is my 25th presentation about my PhD. So, yes, exit stage left. Ultimately, the question that I'm after is, what does the movement of Rapa Nui's basalt artifacts, as traced geochemically from geological source, finger, to archaeological location, fingerprint, tell us about social interaction and the island's proposed collapse? So, lucky enough, this is some data. This is what it looks like when you do geochemistry. You get an Excel spreadsheet. It's identified by major elements, minor trace, and they give us parts per million, sometimes a weight percentage. This is the raw data, folks. This is what science a lot of times is looking exactly at numbers, making sure they're within a standard deviation. They've been measured against standards in other fields. So science is a lot about checking off the boxes of doing good work. So luckily my boss, Marshall, he had all these stones, and we published a pretty cool article in 2017 entitled The Archaeological Documentation and Geochemistry of the Rutoki Adze Quarry and a Fine-Grained Basalt on Rapa Nui. In short, what this ended up telling us is that there were certain rocks that these individuals were using, especially in area right here, area 13, and in area R2 right here. Those 2 places have 2 types of stone that the Rapa Nui people are very much interested in, called Hawaiianite and Bemmerite. They're very hard stone that you can polish, that you can wet wash, and you can make them very important instruments for everything of daily life. So we understood what we were after, we knew the areas we want to go to, but when you go and travel to a new island or another island, you also deal with human beings. You also dealing with being in a place that's so isolated The only land you can see on it is the moon. You are so isolated in the world, so that means you have to bring everything with you. This is a typical archaeological backpack for me. So we always start from the maps. Maps are very important. That's my whole guideline. I got some chocolate, you need that. Your ID, tape measures, you gotta line out the string. You got a first aid kit, you got your Chicago Cubs mug, because you got a drink. Double backpacks, cameras with double batteries, backup chargers, got your Chicago Cubs hoodie, needs to be. You gotta bring your book trail, you gotta read when you're in the field. You gotta have your Frisbee. All scientists play Frisbee. Believe me, it happens. But ultimately, when you try to put this all inside your backpack, you realize you're carrying 8,000 pounds, right? So what I started to do was create a little checklist and to know exactly what I need. If something doesn't have multiple uses, don't bring it. But the most important lesson I can give you after working in the field for so many years is you're only as good as your first aid kit. That is your most important piece of equipment. And I urge you parents to create a first aid kit with your kids. It is the best thing you could possibly do to show them the layers of what you need. So get your gear and get into the field. But once I got there were some puzzles I had to deal with. I'm dealing with multiple entities out there. I'm dealing with the museum. I'm dealing with the National Heritage Council. I'm dealing with the Heritage Advisory Council. I'm dealing with the Development Council, the Indigenous Council, the parks, and so on and so forth. But the most important people for me is the public. Because you're working on their land. You're drilling holes into their artifacts. It's very important that you're very transparent with the culture. Now, I've written about this in multiple things about being a social archaeologist and doing social situations. Sadly, I can't go into that, but in 2 months I will be back giving a chat at the 8th Annual Responsible Conduct of Research and Academic Integrity Conference. Jared, we need a better title. But needless to say, I will talk about that. And I will talk about what it means to build communities with other people, with other languages, with other customs. Science is about diversity. But moving on, so let's actually get into it. So these are the study areas that we picked. In total, we have 5. I know that right away I didn't survey the entire area because other people have done it. Don't regurgitate someone else's work. Do it empirically on your own. So 5 of these study areas have some pretty important things to look at. First, you've got to document them. And we use multiple things. This goes back to my point, my database on your top left there, of getting your empirical data. So here with this Excel sheet, I have site name, site number, location, GPS, what type of site, is it open, is it a mine, what's the max measurement, minimum measurement, what's a description, has a photo been taken of it, did we do any drone work, has it been sampled, has it been analyzed. This is what you keep yourself in check with. And you do it in multiple ways. Sometimes you're in a cave, sometimes you're flying a drone, sometimes you're going out in the field with dogs. Yes, dogs make great archaeologists. Why? Because on Easter Island there's a lot of rats. And what do the dogs like to eat?
Rats.
Rats, very good. So what happens is I work in areas where there's grass as tall as me, and it's hard to see the sites that are on the ground. So what ended up happening is I go out in the field with my dogs, I give them a little bit of food, and the next thing I know, they're gone. And sure enough, I'll find them, head in the ground, butt sticking right up, shaken out, because the rats like to go inside the quarries. It's a perfect area for them to hide inside. So as the rats freak out and try to hide themselves in the quarry, there goes the dogs. Oh, that's great. So anytime you go in the field as an archaeologist, bring a dog. One of the areas that we were interested in was called Rano Kau and Vaiatare. On the bottom left map, it shows you where we're sort of at. We found 13 sites in this area. This was sort of a drone picture. I wish we had a little better of a pull-up here, but what we found out at this place is that these were sources for stones that were being used for construction. We didn't find a lot of evidence at these sites that they were making tools here. So right away, the archaeological interpretation is they're using this to make houses, especially in one place called Orongo, which is the Birdman village. But these sites were nonetheless important. They're still basalt, but it wasn't really what I was looking for. So then we moved to the southern coast there, where we went to what I call the Southern Coast Mining Complex. And what's really interesting is here's all the sites, but if you look to the left, this is the contemporary quarry. This is where today people are excavating stone. And the red triangles are where the archaeological sites are. So what's interesting is the past people already knew where the good stone was. So what did the current contemporary people do? You follow the past. The past is a trail for the present to lead us into the future. So right away here, I knew something was happening. But I didn't realize once I got into it how many sites they were, and they were actually mines. These individuals had worked so hard that they mined inside the land. And they created little caves, or mines as I've been calling them. And this area was super important. It doesn't seem to be the dominant area where they were getting stone, but it nonetheless was a very important site. Two other places that we worked in was Aba Okiti and what we call Putoki Toki, and this was the mother lode. Inside here I found 42 sites dedicated to making stone tools. This is the biggest complex of Easter Island fine-grained basalt material on the island, and it was great to highlight it. One site in particular, and I please excuse the resolution, probably produced close to thousands of tools out of one site. And what they would do is look for these things called puku. And puku is just an outcropping of rock that was good to use. And they would slowly work that puku down, and all these little pieces that you see around in these little areas, in these reduction areas, those are called debitage. So it's a very famous French word. As I'm making a stone tool, there are pieces that are just going to fall to the ground. Those are called debitage. And I can recreate those and remake the tool. So very important sites. When we zoom into one, this site alone probably had thousands of pounds of debitage. So we're dealing with a lot of material being pulled out. So with these sites and all of my samples, now I have my finger. I know where all the material's coming from. I've seen the process of making the stone tool from start until finish. Now I've got to figure, how does it end up in the archaeological record? And for that, I need artifacts. So what I found out though is inside this area, they almost excavated and cleared 12,000 meters squared of area. And I know that probably doesn't mean a lot if you don't know the metric system, but that's basically 2 football fields of area that were cleared and carved and used to get these stone tools. So it's amazing. Think about you just trying to work and walk from one edge of the goalpost to the other. Imagine that filled with quarries and millions of pieces of debitage. It's a beautiful scene. But I want to now find, who are my fingerprints? Where are my candidates? So instead of excavating on the island, which is very hard, you need more permits, you need to work more, I went to the museum. And if you watch the chat in the morning by Erica, yes, it was really awesome because she shows the value of going back to collections. My mom is a genealogist. We have so many books inside the house, and I always ask her, you can have 1,000,000 books, but if you don't read one, what do you have? Just a collection. So you need to analyze these pieces, and every artifact then therefore becomes a book. And on the left there is the list of every archaeologist that has put something in there. Luckily now I'm on that list, and so is my son, who's on the bottom right. So this is what I say, oh, it's your summertime? Oh, you want to have a lot of good time? Guess what, you're going to work, start measuring. Because we got to bring our children into science with us. They need to see us as parents using science and the value of it. Once they understand that mom can read in metric in the English system, like, wow, mom, that's cool. You'd be surprised. Give it a go. I was also lucky enough to work with the Easter Island Statue Project, this famous Moai that was excavated that went around the world. Yes, we did know they had bodies since 1914 when they were first excavated. But when you see them in their grandeur, this is a 15-foot excavation. It's almost 2 stories of digging out. And inside, between the 2 Moais, 157 and 156, we found about 2,000 tools. And that were being used to carve the statues. So I also got those samples, but which is nice compared to my other ones that were coming from around the island, These ones had a temporal control. They were using something called carbon-14. Carbon-14 is a way that we can date things that were alive at one time. They've had to absorb carbon material. You cannot use carbon-14 for rocks. You cannot use it for things that aren't dead, okay? There's other techniques for that. But in this case, what we're using is sweet potatoes. We're using very small sweet potatoes, and we're dating those to understand when they were carving the statues. So in total, I have about 78 samples that are I have about 117 fingers. I've got 78 fingerprints, and now it's time to match those together. My field work has continued, even I kept going back, getting more data, more mapping, more photography. But then all of a sudden, these guys started to travel. The artifacts that I put off the island with the geological samples went from Rapa Nui to Tahiti to New Zealand, which is a Polynesian place, and all the Maori there wanted to see the artifacts. And one guy elbows me. Basically, the short of the story is, I stayed in customs for 2 hours as they went through each artifact. And all they kept saying is, let's see these beauties. Because they, as Polynesians, want to see artifacts from other Polynesian islands. From there, we went to Brisbane, where my university is at Queensland, there to Chicago to analyze, back to Santiago, and then down to Rapa Nui. That box was exactly 49.9 pounds. And I have to thank Land Chile in Tahiti for paying for the other 100 pounds. So we did some 3D scanning as well, as another technique. I didn't really see any 3D scanning out here, maybe I'm wrong, I'll do another spin. But this is a great machine, it's portable, I can bring it in the field with me. And it's a little box that shoots laser beams, 17 of them. And then there's a little table that spins the artifact around. Well, from there, we analyzed a whole bunch in Tahiti, on Rapa Nui, and then we make 3D prints of them. And we can print them out. And then kids can use them, we can measure them, and it's not being so difficult on the collections. Coming into UQ, we end up laying out everything. There's hundreds of bags, hundreds of artifacts, and always double bag your artifacts, because sometimes what can happen is your paint will get stripped off your bag, and if you don't have a bag in the inside, you're lost. Always double bag your information. But here we did a little more morphometrics. We looked at macroscopic observations and microscopic observations. With the help of Martina Magnuson, who does great photography, we photographed in high resolution each photo that we had. And it's really beautiful when you start to see some of these tools were used to carve a statue, some were used to make boats, others to make the platforms and statues. So this is where I get to the sciencing. Bro, do you even science? So this is just sort of a joke, but I thank the Field Museum for allowing me to come in there, especially Lord Debzu, who allowed us to go into the elemental analysis facility where we have both the PXRF and the ICPMS, which I'll talk about. Yeah, so this is basically what we start on the top left. This is everything we were working to sample, and this part on the right image is how much we actually analyzed. So my dad here, sitting in the audience, one of my biggest supporters, you know, when I worked with him, the only thing I learned was how to hold a flashlight and get yelled at, right? So I think I was giving it back to him here, and I just said, you know what, get on that machine and start sciencing for me. So I have him helping on the PXRF. My dad was a scientist at Fermilab as well. And then on the right, he's helped me process as I'm taking notes. So it goes back to my point about kids need to see your parents doing science in some form, the easiest way possible. They will love it. They will absolutely love it. If you want to see these artifacts and on a web page, go to terivaca.net. This is another program, an outreach program that I've been a member of for some time. And we took all of the work my dad did and put it online. So I hope it's good. But on the right are all the elements with the parts per million, one photo that we took, and one map of where it came from. So it's putting the puzzle pieces together. That's a lot about science. And a lot of times you don't have all the puzzle pieces. You gotta work. Now, this is what I use. It sounds so complex. We just call it LAICPMS, which stands for Laser Ablation Inductively Coupled Plasma Mass Spectrometry. I don't even know how I said that, I just went into trance. But ICPMS is a very high quality, very accurate and very precise way to see the elements inside rocks. I'm not going to go through the whole process, but it's basically a laser beam that you shoot your sample. The sample creates a cloud of elements. That goes through a detector. The detector reads those elements and tells us what we have. But we've got to take those measurements against control statements or our control samples, and then we make sure that our machine's working well, so our techniques are well. So you always have a control when you're doing your work. And again, it's about collaboration. My advisor says, even though I'm the archaeologist, I'm not the geochemist. You need to be able in science to wear different hats and touch a lot of the material. And Laura at the Field Museum is the data master, and I could not do this work without her. And it just shows me if you really want to do science, also learn to work in a group, okay? So, this is what you basically get, a spreadsheet that you don't want to look at. But this is what the science comes down to, and you find your own empirical data. Don't just copy and paste something because someone else did. Go to the source. Always go back to the source. And what we did here is that we found multiple rocks. So this is a TSA graph. Basically means total alkali or silica. And it's a way that we can classify basalt rocks to understand what type they are. And right away what we found out is that for Rapa Nui artifacts of our project, they were using multiple rock types. So that's important, because that's talking about them looking for specific material, failing with some, succeeding with other. And that's the important part. For the sources and the fingers, we found that the majority of the sources that we're at, they come together, they're very small. They group together, which means they're very similar signature, which gives us an idea that our machines are working. And that's always a good sign when you're like, yes, it works. We can go back in the data and analyze other things. This is why I say anyone that wants to be an archaeologist, make sure you take stats. Stats is probably one of the most important fields for an archaeologist, because you need to quantify what your results hold. So I take all of the elements that I have, my weight percentage and my parts per million. I do something called PCA, which is a component analysis. It tells me which elements are least like the others, therefore they're really good to analyze. We just published a paper in February, yes, that highlights this work, and it went to a pretty big journal. For me, as a kid coming from Wheaton-Warrenville South, who was a wrestler, who was in a family with a police officer and a genealogist, to see myself in this thing, that is awesome. I made it. I walked that trail. I got another coach sitting right here. I've got colleagues. I got people in my class here. Science is a way forward, folks. It really is. And you may not drive a Mercedes, but you might get a Volkswagen, all right? And that's not a bad thing. But what this artifact ultimately showed, and this is just a biplot, so we use that with the PCA analysis to understand a couple things. The circles that you see are the quarries, the 5 sources. The upside down triangle, the tornado, is the artifacts. So what happens then with that circle, that's a 90% probability that that artifact falls inside that quarry. And that lets us know where things are coming from. So this area, this big area right here, was from Rano Kau and from Vaiatare, which there were no archaeological evidence for tool making, and sure enough, no artifacts came from there. So the archaeological evidence backs up the geological evidence. If you can just see this part right here in the middle, you'll see a whole bunch of artifacts that are not inside the circle. What does that mean? Crickets? Crickets. Now I know how you feel. Does anyone know why I don't have those artifacts in the middle in a source place? Usually one person knows this. Get it. Say again? Okay, that's a good one. You're close. You're close. I haven't found these quarries yet. So as I told you, science is never done. You get an answer, you make more questions. So what I found out here, which is my next grant proposal, is where are these? Where are these quarries at? Because all the other artifacts fall between two places. Putokitoki, the biggest complex, and the southwest coast. I can take this graph and make it a little more visual. What we find out here is that almost 90% of all the rocks that were used to make the stone tools come from one place. Although some material is coming from the southwest coast, multiple things are coming from just one place. We argue for that this is communal use of stone. That perhaps these groups are working together to get stone to carve the statues of the ancestors. When we try to carbon date that from our sweet potato, we know that dates around 1455 AD, they were carving statues. So to put it in context, when the War of the Roses is starting and Gutenberg is making his publication of the Bible for the first time, Easter Island people are carving statues. Human beings, not aliens, carving statues. With 90% of the stone tools coming from just one spot. If we look at other stone tools on the island, we know the Moai, right here, coming from Ranoraku. There's only one site for Moai, but they're all over the island. There's only one site for their hats at Puno Pau, but they're all over the island. The obsidian from Orito, found in one place, is all around the island. When I add my research, basalt, found in one place, found all around the island. What does this tell us? That these groups are working together. This is not a group that collapsed, that we're competing, that we're only fighting, that we're trying to compete to keep up with the Joneses. No. Because they were so isolated, in the middle of nowhere, they needed to work together. That's the science message I give you. We need to work together. Everyone has a role to play on this. So when I think about collapse, the story tells us that Easter Island cut all its trees down. It imploded. There was cannibalism. There was widespread erosion. All of those things in the last 20 years have been proven the majority false. Jared Diamond does nothing more than sell books. He's a synthesizer. He's spent maybe 1 month on the island to tell the story that everyone reads. I've been on the island for 17 years and I'm still trying to figure it out. So putting that time in is crucial. So people ask you, do the Easter Island people collapse? You say no. They transformed. They changed. They became something different because they are alive and well today. So I leave you with this picture. I argue that the National Geographic shows a great picture of the Moai walking. Is usually a question, how do they transport them? Well, one of them is moving like a rocking machine, like a refrigerator that you're trying to move one way, right? And you move backwards. The argument is you need to cut down trees as rollers and move these. But that's not the case. You don't need to. All you have to do is get that motion going. Control the pitch, and that Moai will move forward. And all these people moving around and all these groups are working together to make it happen. So, no one is an island. There's so many people to thank, including old teachers and colleagues and parents, and millions of people on the island. I dedicate this presentation to Hotu Matua and Josie. Hey Matiao kia koe korua. Hey Matiao. Reference cited, because you always go back to your sites. And I'd be happy to take any questions. Thank you for your time.
Solar battery chargers must be a godsend for you.
Yes, they are. They very much are. And we have a solar panel on top too of the house, but that's just for our water. Solar panels, I mean, I used the first one. I went to Russia in 2002. They were really slow, not a whole day to charge. Now you're there in about 4 hours and you can recharge your stuff. So yes, double batteries at all time. So the question is, have you heard that? How much is above the ground for the Moai and below the ground? Well, there's one Moai that's 66 feet long, 6 stories. He's about 80% open. But there are others that are 30, 40 feet long, and only 8 feet are showing. So another iceberg all the way down. So the gentleman's questions about maybe some groups throughout the island had resources for perhaps exchange, reciprocity. Let me just go to the map right here. 1 second, bear with me. So, yes, you're exactly right. Our idea is that there were probably events like ceremonies, that they had dances and dinners, that they would feed the crowd coming to them, but that crowd had to bring something in return. So maybe that's the mechanism, bringing obsidian and basalt, maybe a Moai, maybe a later transaction, that you set the relationship up and say, I really believe that some groups were able to constrict some resources too. So one site that we've looked at was made for fish hooks, and right next to the site, there's a huge platform next to it. Now, we're trying to argue that there is a lot more collaboration, but at times, there was probably competition and control because only the elite use stone fish hooks to go out in the water to get the big fish. So if you don't want other people eating your quality stuff, you can't come into this quarry. This is property of the elite. So most likely there were multiple ways that stone was being transferred. And I think that warfare paid less than is talked about now. Cool, thanks for the question. That was a good one, mate. Well, give yourselves a hand for sticking around the whole time. Enjoy the rest of STEMCom. Thank you.